It's a great pleasure both to be here as a teacher, but then to see students with whom one's had some sort of association come back and discuss the work that they've been doing and be really thrilled by the progress that they've made. My connection with Ruth is somewhat indirect, if you will, because she got her PhD with my husband, but I knew her at that time, and so I feel as though I have a long connection with her. She got her PhD in '79 and her MD here in '81, and then went on, in addition, to take a residency in psychiatry and then also do a fellowship in sleep medicine. And that's going to be, as you can see from, well, you can't see from the title directly, but it's going to be one of the things she's going to tell us about. And in discussing her talk with Ruth before, she's combined data from lots of different sources to give us more insight into seasonality and then its effect on these other aspects. So that at present time, unlike some of our other speakers who have MDs but don't practice, Ruth is director of the Center for Sleep Medicine at the University of Wisconsin, and also as professor, she is involved in directing sleep research, which she can do about a third of the time in addition to her clinical responsibilities. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Ruth Benca, who's going to talk to us on seasonality, mood, and migration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Janet, for the introduction, and it is really an honor to be here to participate in this celebration. I actually have to thank Janet because she was instrumental in my being here, and she may not remember, but it was almost 35 years ago to the day, I think, practically, that you actually interviewed me for Pritzker. So fortunately, you must have told them to let me in, and so my being here today is in large part due to you. I should also mention that another important sort of point in my career in getting here was when I was a freshman in college. I took a rather challenging calculus class, and my teacher at the time was a young graduate student who had pity on pre-meds and applied a kinder, gentler curve to us than in more rigorous institutions like the University of Chicago. So I also have to thank Bob Zimmer for making it possible for me to be here today and not ruining my GPA before I got started. All right, so we're going to talk today about seasonality, and the reason I chose to talk about this was because we're celebrating the 500th Convocation, and as President Zimmer told us earlier today, in many universities they mark the years, and the European universities who have been around for centuries, may have 500 years. We have 500 convocations, and we mark our convocations by the seasons, and we name them seasonally, the winter, spring, summer, and fall or autumn convocations. So I want to really try to get across the idea that seasonality is really a very important determinant of behavior and physiology, and applies, really very broadly, I think, and should be considered more in medicine. And to start out with, I'm going to talk a little bit about seasonal patterns of graduation at the University of Chicago, because when they asked me to do this, I asked them for a little data, and I got the last 10 years of commencement data or convocation data, and did a little analysis of this. And this is probably not too surprising for you. And I tried to break this down by species as opposed to putting them all together. So at the top here we have our undergraduates, our baccalaureate degrees, and not surprisingly, not much activity anywhere except in the spring, where there's this huge peak of graduation. Master's students and many of our professional students, law, business, medicine schools, again show this very clear peak of activity in the spring, not too much elsewhere. The PhD students are actually a little bit more interesting, I think. And that's because they are not as, how should we say, entrained by our structures as to when they graduate. We just try to sort of get them out whenever we can. And what you see here is that although there is still a little bit of a peak in the spring, there are high graduation rates in the summer and the fall as well, but not much going on in the winter. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll understand that maybe there's a little bit more to this than simply how somebody has arbitrarily decided to run the academic year. All right, so today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about seasonal patterns in sleep, mood, and other behaviors in general in humans in terms of population studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the seasonality patterns in patients with mood disorders, and then I'm going to try to convince you that a cute little fellow called the white-crowned sparrow that migrates every year is kind of an interesting model, not only for seasonal changes in behavior, but perhaps a model for a very common human disorder of bipolar illness. All right, so let's talk first about seasonality in humans. And not surprisingly, most of the work that has been done in recent years on human seasonality comes from Northern Europe, and in particular Scandinavia, where there are, of course, some of the most dramatic changes in seasonal patterns of daylight exposure. So in this study that was just recently done in Finland, they found that the vast majority of Finnish people reported seasonal variations in mood and behavior, and that those who were the most seasonal also seemed to have the highest rates of depression. And the farther north in the country that people go, and Finland is one of those countries that really, covers quite a range of latitude up there, the more northern dwelling people had even higher seasonality scores than those in the south. This is a study that was done in Norway, and this in this population study, something around 12,000 individuals were asked to fill out a seasonality scale. And this kind of shows the distribution of seasonality traits in the Norwegian population. And what I've done here is to color in green here those who are considered to be strongly seasonal. The blue are moderate, and the clear bars are people who are not particularly seasonal at all. And what comes out of this data and other studies is the fact that women in general tend to have higher seasonality scores than men. So there are sort of a greater proportion of women at these extreme levels than of the men, and more men who report low seasonality. Another interesting feature about seasonality is that there are developmental aspects of this. So seasonality becomes somewhat more prevalent across adolescence and young adulthood, but as humans go through puberty, we start to see this split with women showing greater seasonality than men, and that is true for other aspects of behavior as well, and in particular looking here at anxiety and depression. So this is again data from the Norwegian cohort showing that once again, actually showing here the rates of anxiety and depressive symptoms related to seasonality. So the black bars are the most seasonal, the people that were at that right-hand extreme. And what we see is that in both men and women, both anxiety and depression symptoms or features increase with seasonality. this was a Swedish study. Again, with lots of Scandinavians here looking at this, that actually tracked people across the year and asked them to report about their mood, to say what time of year were they feeling worst, and also their eating behavior. And on the left, we see that both men and women are very similar in that they tend to feel worst in the winter, so January, February, and sort of starting to peak here, October, November, December, and they tend to feel the best, or least worst in this case, in the summer months where the days are longer. In terms of the eating behavior, and this is men and women are combined and there were no real differences, is that in general the times that people reported eating the least were in the summer. They tend to eat the most in the winter, although there was a little peak here of some people liking to eat in the summer, probably because of availability of certain kinds of foods there, but clearly seasonal patterns in eating. Now, finally, this is a study that was done in a Swiss population. And in this study, individuals were asked first to rank themselves on are you seasonal or not. And then they looked at the actual patterns of both psychological symptoms and vegetative symptoms, meaning things like sleep, appetite, and weight, across the year. And not surprisingly, the people who reported themselves as being seasonal showed much more dramatic fluctuations in these parameters across the seasons, but even people who were supposedly not seasonal still showed significant seasonal variation. So the bottom line is, whether we like to admit it or not, we're all a bit seasonal, particularly when we are exposed to changes in the light-dark cycle across seasons. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about seasonality and mood disorders, because seasonality is probably more striking in patients with certain mood disorders than probably any other medical illness. And many of you have heard of seasonal affective disorder or winter depression, and this refers to people having major depressive episodes that tend to recur in the fall and the winter, and they go away or remit in the spring or the summer. And the seasonal aspect can be applied to people who have major depressive disorder, which means only episodes of depression, and also individuals who have bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness, in which case there's a typical pattern of depression in the fall and winter and hypomania or mania appearing in the spring and summer. The symptoms of depression in these individuals, the winter depression, are a little bit atypical in that these individuals report sleeping excessively and eating excessively, sometimes gaining a lot of weight in the winter, in contrast to the more common presentation of depression, which is usually insomnia and loss of appetite. What's also very interesting is this disorder is light responsive, in that light therapy or increasing light exposure in the fall and the winter can either prevent or at least mitigate the symptoms. And in North America, the prevalence of this disorder is somewhere between 1% and 3%, although it's estimated that up to a quarter of the population has what we call subsyndromal aspects of this, and I would argue that what we're really talking about is this variation in patterns of seasonality across the population. Now, of mood disorders and of psychiatric disorders in general, bipolar disorder is the disorder that is the most exquisitely seasonal, and actually, interestingly, is the disorder that is most closely associated with dramatic changes in sleep patterns and where sleep manipulations can actually affect the disorder. So a number of studies have shown, both twin studies, and also studies comparing groups of patients with bipolar to other disorders, is that the bipolar patients are the most seasonal of all. And actually, there was an interesting study done fairly recently that compared groups of patients with mood disorders and divided them up not just into those with major depressive illness and bipolar disorder, but within those disorders separated out the non-seasonal versus the seasonal subtypes and compared them to normal controls. And what we see here, and this is in terms of their mood scores, but the same thing was found in terms of many other seasonal patterns of sleep and eating and other types of behaviors, is that non-seasonal depressives are more seasonal than normal people. Seasonal depressives are more seasonal than non-seasonal depressives, and similar to non-seasonal bipolar disorders. And the most seasonal of all are people with seasonal bipolar disorder. And so they're really quite different from just about everybody else. And again, as I mentioned, there is a unique association between sleep and bipolar disorder as well. There are characteristic changes in sleep architecture, in the episodes of mania, patients may become almost completely sleepless or insomniac and sleep very little. And what's really interesting, comparing a manic patient who's not sleeping to a patient with insomnia, is that these individuals report that they don't really feel like they need to sleep. They just have so much energy, and they simply do not find this to be necessarily problematic. Now, along those lines, if you look at people who are simply short sleepers, people who regularly night after night sleep less than 6 hours and never catch up, never sleep in, that's all they seem to need to sleep, and you actually administer mood scales to them, you find that they tend to score high in terms of symptoms of hypomania. They don't report any problems. They seem to function fine. So they're probably just sort of chronically and stably a little bit hypomanic, if you will. Now I want to talk a little bit about bipolar disorder, because I think it's actually one of the most fascinating disorders, certainly in psychiatry, and it's a rather unusual disorder. Sort of the classic bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness, we know occurs in about 1% of the population. I mean, about 1 in 100 people will have a frank manic episode at one point of their lives. But we now estimate that probably a much larger percentage of the population is affected with this disorder. In many cases, it's the depressive phase that is more common, and recent studies have suggested that about 5 to 10% of the population may have bipolar depression and be susceptible possibly to episodes of mania at some point. This is data from the most recent large-scale epidemiologic study of psychiatric illness in the U.S. population that was done by Kessler a few years back. And I actually took this data and manipulated it a little bit. The prevalence of major depression is much higher than bipolar disorder, and what we're always taught and what we teach psychiatrists these days is that major depression is much more common, at least 2 to 2.5 times as common as bipolar illness, but bipolar illness is a much more severe disorder. So I took the prevalence data, and I also took the data of how many people had mild, moderate, or serious disorders. And if we look on the left here, we see that close to 7% of the U.S. population in a given year has a major depressive disorder episode. And of those, about a third of them are severe, half of them are moderate, and 20% are mild. But if we look at the patients with bipolar disorder, we see the vast majority of them have severe illness, and only some of them have moderate illness. And so the question is this a disorder that is truly less common than major depression? And are there less people affected and it's a more serious disorder? Or another way of thinking about this is that maybe the disorders have somewhat similar prevalence, and what has happened to these individuals. And what I'm going to try to argue for you today is that because of adaptive features of bipolar illness, is that these people may be present but not recognized or perceived as having a problem. And that's because if you look at data on individuals with bipolar disorder and some of the features, it's been suggested that there are some interesting evolutionary advantages to having some traits of bipolar illness. And for example, having symptoms of, or some traits of depression and anxiety are very useful to make you more sensitive to the feelings of others around you, and particularly adaptive to help in a caretaking role. So maybe it's not surprising that women have about twice the rate of anxiety and depressive disorders that men do, because they are primarily the caretakers. In contrast, things like cyclothymia, sort of highs and lows, really kind of go with creativity, seduction, and hyperthymia, or being a little bit hypomanic, sort of fits with some of the kinds of sort of risk-taking behavior that's necessary in leadership, exploration, territoriality, and mating. And so that having some of these features might be useful for the species as a whole. There have also been proposed some theories as to why seasonal affective disorder, winter depression, is adaptive, particularly for women who are much more highly affected by this disorder. And that is that up to about 50 or so years ago, humans, like many other species, were highly seasonal reproducers. We tended to bear our young in the spring. The advent of indoor lighting and electricity has flattened out those rhythms somewhat, but if you look back at historical data, we were probably just as seasonal as a lot of farm animals and other species, which we know tend to always reproduce in the spring. So the idea, though, is that if you gain weight and sleep a lot in the winter, it's much more adaptive for pregnancy. And of course, you want to have young born in the spring when food is more plentiful, particularly if you're in a climate where the seasons change rather dramatically. And finally, I want to point out, I think, some of the most really intriguing data about bipolar disorder, and a lot of this really stems from the work of Kay Redfield Jamison and others who have studied individuals with bipolar disorder, and we now know that people with bipolar illness are disproportionately represented in artists, writers, musicians, and presidents of Fortune 500 companies, for that matter. So being a little bipolar might be good for you. Obviously, being too much is not so good. All right, so now we're going to kind of turn to the next part here and try to understand a little bit what might be going on in terms of some of these changes in behavior. And seasonal affective disorder, winter depression, of course, occurs in the winter and has been likened to hibernation. I think a lot of us will joke around in the winter when we feel more sleepy and more hungry that we're kind of going into hibernation mode. And conversely, there have been some, well, I would sort of liken the episodes of migration that are shown by some species to hypomania or mania, and we know from the human literature that people with bipolar illness are most likely to have episodes of mania in the spring or summer, and with a second peak in the fall, and very unlikely to have those episodes in the winter. And now I'm going to try to convince you that the migratory sparrow could be a model for seasonal behavior in humans, and maybe a model for the adaptive aspects of bipolar illness in humans. And let's talk a little bit, why should we study birds? Birds are not really very highly related to us, but birds are very interesting from a sleep perspective because they are the only non-mammalian group to show sleep patterns that are really very similar to mammals, in that they're the only other group that has unequivocal non-REM and REM sleep. And at that moment, I should just remind people, of course, that REM sleep was first described here in 1953 by Azarinsky and Kleitman, and so the University of Chicago really is the birthplace of the field of sleep medicine. Birds are also capable of higher cognitive function, and if you don't believe me, I think in a few minutes you should, and I just say that there are some birds that are smarter than some mammals, and probably mammals you've all known. Okay. And some other interesting things we know about birds is that there are similar neural mechanisms that govern sleep and wakefulness in birds. And we've done work in our laboratory showing that gene expression in sleep and waking, the patterns of gene expression are very similar in birds and mammals. That we have shown that birds respond similarly to sleep deprivation as do mammals in terms of how they regulate deep sleep or slow wave sleep, and also how they show a rebound of REM sleep if they're deprived for prolonged periods of time. But what's very interesting about the birds is that some birds show some very dramatic seasonal changes in behavior, as I'm going to show you, which makes them an interesting model. And so this is the bird that we had the good fortune to study for a few years. This is the white-crowned sparrow, and he's a very cute little bird. This bird they spend the winter in Northern California in the Sacramento Valley, and then in the spring they fly up to Alaska, some of them almost to the polar regions. They breed, and then they head back down again in the fall to get out of the cold, dark Alaskan winters. These birds have been brought to the lab previously. That's why we chose them, because we knew one of the interesting things is that they still go through some of their migratory behavior in the lab. Obviously, they can't fly several thousand miles, but they try. And they will go through something called migratory restlessness in the cage, where they are trying to take off and fly. So we went out and caught these birds. This is one of the students from the lab up in Alaska with these little fine mist nets, and we kind of have decoys and play bird sounds for them, and they come out and we catch them. And this is a bird that's just been brought out, caught in the net, and we bring them back to Wisconsin, and we put them in an aviary, and each bird is in an individual cage, and they can kind of see and hear each other, and there are infrared beams so we can look at their activity, and we have an infrared camera, and we can also, as you'll see in a moment, we can record their sleep and do other things as well. So the birds were brought in, and we have looked at several aspects of their behavior. And this I want to show you is data from about a year and a half of one particular representative bird. And these are the activity patterns. And what we do with these birds is we subject them to the same light-dark cycles that they would normally experience in the wild. So we have to kind of know where they are at different times of the year and look at the geologic data and the seasonal data of the light-dark cycle. And so we adjust the light pattern. And the dark lines in between the yellow lines are beam breaks. So every time the bird moves, they kind of tick off a signal there. And so when there's a lot of dark lines there, you know that the bird is awake and active. And so if we look up here, this is actually winter. And as the days are getting longer, this is spring, and you see this very intense activity. This is just some lost data here. Very intense activity when the birds are going through their migratory behavior at night, because typically these birds fly at night, and during the daytime they're foraging and just kind of eating and getting ready to fly again the next night. This is the summer, and now here in the summer, apparently with these very long days, they're sleeping at night. They're not being active. And here is the fall migration, again heading back down to California, or so this bird thinks. And fall migrations in general tend to be a little less robust than spring migrations, because there's not such a rush to get south as there is to go north to find a breeding ground. We can also put these birds in a constant light-dark cycle, about 12-12, so that they have 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark. And if we keep them on a cycle like that across the year, they will still go through this migratory behavior twice a year. And that's because the seasonal behavior is kind of directed by an internal clock, much like our circadian or daily rhythm. It's not simply a response to the light-dark cycle. It is endogenously generated, and it will occur even if the bird isn't exposed to seasons, although maybe not as robustly. So one of the things we were really interested in trying to figure out was how do these birds sleep? Because one of the questions that comes up is if you're a bird and flying, hundreds of miles at night and spending most of the night flying, and then during the daytime you've got to eat because you just flew hundreds of miles and are going to have to do it again the next night, when do you sleep? And do these birds sleep? And if they don't sleep, how do they manage? So we recorded their sleep at 4 times of year that were chosen to try to pick out the extremes. And so we took the longest days of the year when they're in California. So this is kind of late in December, around the winter solstice, when they only have about 9 hours of light a day. We picked the longest days of the year in the summer solstice here at the end of June, when they have about 21 and a half hours of light a day. And then we picked the spring and the fall migration. One of the interesting things about migration is that it is almost at these sort of zero crossing points, and at the time when the rate of change of the day length is the most extreme, that the birds tend to migrate. So this is spring migration, fall migration, these individual birds. And again, on the fall, we couldn't pick one day when they were all migrating, and we have these groups of birds, and we actually recorded their sleep. And what we found was actually rather surprising, at least to us, which is that we found that in the winter, the birds slept a lot. In fact, they spent a little bit over 1/3 of their time asleep. In that sense, they're very similar to humans, because humans also spend about 1/3 of the day asleep. So 1/3 of their day is asleep. But in the spring, the summer, and the fall, they slept less than half that much. And in fact, they got the least sleep in the summer. We also see an increase in time spent awake. Again, spring, summer, and fall, they spend much more time awake, much less in the winter. And birds have an interesting state of sleep that humans don't have, but some other large mammals like cattle have, which is a state of drowsiness. And we know that drowsiness has some features of sleep in it, and it has been suggested by some people that maybe birds make up for migration by spending more time being drowsy, but in fact, there's no seasonal change in drowsiness. They spend the same amount of time being drowsy in the winter, when they're sleeping over twice as much as they do at the times of the year when they're sleeping far less. Another interesting thing that we found, though, was not only did the amount of sleep change dramatically across the year, but the pattern of sleep changed dramatically. And I'm going to just have you look at the blue lines here. And in the winter, these dark bars show when the lights are off, and so these are the long nights. What we see is that the birds spend very little time sleeping. They're mostly awake in the light. The minute the lights go off, and shortly after they go to sleep, they tend to stay asleep, and they start anticipating the dawn in the morning. In the summer, when they are exposed to almost 22 hours of daylight, we see a similar beginning of the day. They're in the light, they stay awake, but after about 16 hours, they start to go to sleep, even though it's still bright light outside. They can't stay awake any longer. And what's very interesting about this is that studies in humans show that after about 16 hours of wakefulness, we also start to shut down and don't function as well cognitively. So this may be an intrinsic property of neurons or the brain, of there's only so long that these systems can keep running before they need to sleep. But what's different in the spring and the fall here is, if you look at the blue lines, is you don't see much of a day-night pattern. These lines are fairly flat, and that's because we suddenly lose any kind of day-night organization of sleep. The birds tend to be more asleep during the day in the spring and the fall when they're migrating than they do in the summer and the winter, and they're more awake at night, not unlike a lot of patients who complain about insomnia, feeling very fatigued and sleepy during the day and unable to stay asleep at night. Another thing we found out was that the difference in sleep length, certainly in the summer versus the winter, is likely related to the duration of the photoperiod or the day. So if we take birds in the summertime and we expose them to the lighting conditions they would normally experience in the wild, they're awake most of the time and they sleep very little. If in the summer we put them on a 12-12 light-dark cycle, so 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark, they suddenly start spending about a third of their time asleep, much like they do in the winter. So when exposed to longer dark periods, they will sleep more. However, the migratory behavior is not influenced by the light-dark cycle. And even if we put them in a long night, they will still migrate and they will still sleep very little. I'm going to skip that. Okay, but this is, again, another way of looking at this data, again, comparing the summer and the winter. If we look at the ratio of the duration of a period of waking to a period of sleep, because birds sleep in smaller packets than humans do, but we're probably not a whole lot different. Even if we take a nap during the day, it's usually pretty short, whereas our waking periods are long. And conversely, at night, our sleep periods are long, and if we have an arousal during the night, it's fairly short. So if we look at those ratios, birds like humans will tend to have relatively consolidated sleep, so longer bouts of sleep to shorter bouts of waking in the winter and the summer. And you can see here, this is how we can define a sleep period where the sleeping bout becomes longer preferentially than the waking bout. But in the spring and the fall when they're migrating, you can't really discern from looking at their behavior a sleep period or a night, if you will. So they basically kind of become totally dysregulated in terms of their behavior. So we know that these migratory birds sleep much more in the winter than the summer. They show a very strong day-night pattern in the sleep, both in the winter and the summer, even when they're at their extremes of sleeping a lot or sleeping a little. And this is partly regulated by the duration of the light-dark cycle. And in the migratory period, this day-night pattern disappears, and regardless of whether it's during migration or during the summer, there don't seem to be any compensatory increases in drowsiness to make up for this supposed loss of sleep in comparison to the increased sleep in the winter. Now, another question we had was whether any of these behavioral changes in sleep were associated with changes in any other kinds of behavior. Because we know, for example, if we think about bipolar disorder, certainly bipolar patients show dramatic changes of sleep, of sleeping a lot when they're depressed and not very much at all when they're manic. But there are also a lot of other things that change about their behavior in addition to their sleep. And the nice thing about birds is that they are actually pretty smart, as you'll see, and we can use a lot of similar tests to look at aspects of sort of their emotional and cognitive regulation, similar to what we can do in humans. So we can look at motivation, we can look at learning, and we can look at impulsivity. And I'm going to show you some examples of that and what happens. First, I want to just kind of tell you, though, what happens in general with sleep deprivation. And this is true both of rodents as well as humans, is if we're sleep deprived and we're given a task where we have to kind of keep performing or stay motivated, we tend to not do it as much, and we tend to stop responding. We lose our attention or concentration, and we sort of go on to something else. And the same thing is true with rats. So this is an example of a sleep-deprived rat who's asked to press a lever to earn a reward, and after 5 days of sleep restriction or sleep deprivation, the rat does not press the lever as much as a normal control rat who is sleeping adequately. The same thing is true in our migratory birds. So we trained these birds a task, which I'm going to show you in a moment, where the bird has to learn a series of key pecks to earn a reward. And when the birds are sleep deprived, and these include, we actually had non-migratory as well as the migratory species, they all do the same thing. You sleep deprive them, they don't respond as much. Now I'm going to show you the task, actually, and this is where I'm going to convince you that birds are very smart. Each day the bird is confronted with 3 keys, which you're going to see, and each day it has to learn a new sequence of pecking those keys. And we change it every day, and we don't tell the bird the new sequence. It has to figure it out. Not only does the bird have to figure out the sequence, and this is a bird that's just gone in, it has to do it 3 times in a row correctly to earn a reward. And this bird's been doing this for a while, and I think you're going to see that this bird knows exactly what it's supposed to do. I don't know that I would have been able to figure this out without specific directions. Okay, so he hasn't gotten it right yet. So now, okay, that one was correct. He's figuring out the sequence. So center is the first key, left, and then right. We do give him a color cue. So one correct. Now he's doing it over again. Now he knows he's got to do it 3 times. So he does it 3 times. And he knows he's done it 3 times, and he's going to get his reward now. Now the hopper's closed, and to get more goodies, he's got to do it again. And he knows that it's center, and then he's waiting for the cue, and the equipment is not working quite to his satisfaction right now, as you're going to see. Center, and then he knows he's supposed to peck this. He's pecking it, and it's like, let's hurry up and get this show on the road. Okay, so, and then he knows he's got to do it one more time, and he gets his reward, and you get the idea here. And so we trained birds to do this, and I had these wonderful patient students in the lab who, and you know, did this with a group of birds over a year, every day. And what we see here is the patterns of the number of responses per session in the migratory species as compared to a very closely genetically related species that doesn't migrate so much. Maybe it migrates from Sacramento Valley to like Oregon or something, but it certainly doesn't go to Alaska. And what you see here is this dramatic seasonal change in the number of responses in the migratory species and this relatively flat non-seasonal pattern in the non-migrating subspecies. Furthermore, although these birds not only respond at a greater rate and peck the key many more times, but they do it correctly, and they earn many more rewards. And so you could argue, well, while they're migrating and doing all these other things, they need this extra food, so this is very adaptive to increase this responding. So what we wanted to figure out was, do these birds simply just crank everything up and go faster at everything? Or are they really adaptive and trying to do what they need to do to survive? So we devised another task for them. And this was a task that they got rewarded for waiting. And so to do the task correctly, there would be a signal. The bird has to wait 20 seconds. It has to know when 20 seconds is up, it pecks the key, it gets a reward, and then it can start over. If it waits anything less than 20 seconds, it gets nothing, and the system resets. So so the ideal thing is to wait just a little more than 20 seconds, and you can earn the most rewards possible. And I'm going to just show you what that looks like. And it's kind of interesting because you see how a bird waits. And I like to, having been a parent, birds wait like 2 or 3-year-olds wait. So you'll see in a minute. So bird pecks the key, gets his reward. He's just waited 20 seconds. And now he's going to wait. Okay, there's nothing left. It's finished. Okay, he's waiting. It's like children jumping up and down in the back of the car. Are we there yet? You know. So he's waiting and waiting, waiting some more. Okay. He knows it's almost time. And he pecks and he gets his reward. Okay, so he did that very well. And sometimes the birds don't do it so well, and we'll see what happens then. So this is the wrong way. So he's pecking, looking for something, nothing is there. And, you know, he's jumping up and down. Yes, okay, I'll jump up and down, and now it'll be time. Pecks, nothing. Jump up and down a little bit more. You can see this bird does not look anything like the other bird in terms of being able to do this. He sort of gets it, but he's just getting very frustrated and not getting anywhere. Okay, so what we found was if we look at groups of birds who are trained to do this task across the seasons, that in general, they have higher rates of responding during their migratory periods in the spring and the fall, and they earn less rewards. And their behavioral inhibition rate, which if they were doing the task perfectly would be close to 1, drops down. They're over-responding inappropriately and not getting rewards. And there's a lot of actual variability amongst these birds, just like there's variability in behaviors of other species. And I want to show you my particular favorite bird. This is my real bipolar sparrow. This is the same bird across 4 seasons, and this bird was doing this task. So here we start in the winter, and the bird has gotten very good at doing this task. This is the cumulative number of responses, so across a 30-minute test period, he responds at sort of a very constant rate, a little over, around 20 times. He earns about 20 rewards, and that's about right with the timing and the resetting of the system. It's about as many rewards as he's going to get. That same bird, a few weeks later, enters his migratory period, and look what happens. He responds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, almost 800 times. I always have to count this because I can't. 800 times he pecks the key, and he keeps doing it at a fairly constant clip. For the whole half hour, he doesn't earn a single reward. The same bird, a few weeks later in the summer, not sleeping very much, long day, again, is doing the task just fine. And here is the same bird now in the fall during a migratory period. Again, 1, 2, almost 400 pecks. Actually, he earned maybe 1 or 2 rewards in this one because once or twice he actually waited 20 seconds. So this bird flips back and forth between being able to time and keep track of things to just not being able to inhibit his behavior. Furthermore, if we sleep deprive the birds at various times of year, we find that the effects of sleep deprivation are the opposite of migration. Remember, I told you that not sleeping causes animals to respond less, but migrating makes them respond more. And if we look here, we have birds in the winter and in the summer who respond at sort of relatively adaptive rates, and if we sleep deprive them, they respond less. In the spring, this is a fall non-migratory bird. We put that in as a control. This is spring during migration. Again, these very elevated rates, and one week we can shut the rates down is on top of migrating, we sleep deprive them. And interestingly, a migrating sleep-deprived bird earns more rewards than the bird does when it's migrating and sleeping the little it does. So again, opposite and additive effects. So, just to summarize this, we see that in addition to very dramatic changes in sleep, there are associated interesting and significant changes in behavior, which is that the rates of responding in these birds increase whether it's adaptive, meaning it causes them to earn more food rewards, or maladaptive, causing them to earn less rewards when they are migrating. They just crank up their behavior and their response rate. But when they're not migrating, we see only the adaptive increases. They only increase their responding in the summer, for example, when it's useful for them to do that. And in general, the behavioral inhibition decreases during migration. So with these data and some other things we've done in the lab, we think that the patterns of seasonal behavior in migrating birds are really not that dissimilar to not only normal patterns of seasonality in humans, but maybe suggestive or consistent with some of the patterns we see in individuals who have been identified as having bipolar disorder. First of all, both migration and bipolar disorder have a seasonal component. There are characteristic changes in sleep, increased sleep during these sort of depressive or winter phases, and decreased sleep during kind of manic or hypomanic phases. In migration, like in bipolar illness, there is an increase in activity and in goal-directed behaviors, but also an increase in impulsivity. And in some other work we've done in the lab, which I'm not going to show you, we find that genes that tend to be overexpressed in migration are some of the same genes that have been implicated in bipolar disorder. And so, that takes us to this whole idea of thinking about seasonal rhythms. And I think we've all, over the last few decades understood the importance of thinking about circadian rhythms and how important that is for health and disease, and even just thinking about how we treat certain disorders, and that measuring something at 9 o'clock in the morning is not the same as measuring at 9 o'clock at night. And I'd argue that seasonality, particularly in some individuals, may be just as an important a factor in affecting not only sleep and behavior, but possibly also physiology, because that also shows seasonal changes. And so this is something that really should be studied. It also raises an interesting question about this idea of how much we need to sleep. And so we know sleep is very important for brain function and that it is important for basically clearing out and restoration of brain synapses. But sleep may also have sort of an ecological function of keeping us out of harm's way has been suggested. And so maybe, for example, these birds sleep more in the winter not because they need to sleep more, but if it's a long, dark night, they're better off sleeping than getting into harm's way and being eaten by a predator. So now I want to go back to the slide I started with, which are the seasonal patterns of graduation at University of Chicago commencements. And if we look at this, what is very striking is that in most cases, the winter commencement rates are the lowest. Even our PhD students who have really no constraints about when they can graduate have their peak in the spring, the summer, even in the fall, and then tend to, after the long, hard, cold winters, sort of wait till the spring to graduate, I guess. I'm not sure. So, it makes you even think about, well, why do we have spring commencements anyway? Why do we arrange our schedules that way? Maybe it's because it's the time of year that is best to allow our students to sort of take flight and wend their way from the university and get started on their new lives. It's a good season for migration, perhaps. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the importance of studying seasonal rhythms and why it's so difficult and probably why so few people do it. And this was a wonderful quotation from Michael Menneker, who's one of the great circadian biologists, somewhat adapted by Martin Wikelski, which is that the study of circannual rhythms is notoriously difficult, mostly owing to the unfavorable ratio of the period length of a single circannual cycle to the productive life of the biologist and to the funding cycles of most agencies, since you have to, study several years of data before you get a few points in time. And then finally, I just want to thank some of my collaborators, Chiara Cirelli, one of my colleagues who's helped a lot with the genetic work, and the students and postdocs in my lab over the years. And I will stop there and take a few questions if anybody has any. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think that Ruth has raised a number of questions that must challenge all of us.
Turn the lights on.
In how we have thought about these problems before, and certainly I had never thought of migrating birds and people with bipolar disorders as having any relationship, and it's a challenging idea to think about. So, questions, please. Maybe I could, Bernie.
Are these birds bred in captivity, or are all your tests done with birds that at some point have been in the wild?
Okay, that's a great question. So Dr. Strauss is asking whether these birds were bred in captivity or they were out in the wild. That was actually, to me, the most fun part of doing this work. These are wild-caught birds. So there was no ordering animals from an animal supplier or breeding them. We actually, every bird we studied, we had to go out and capture.
But that means that all these birds were subject to natural conditions of light and dark at some point, so there was
Correct.
No way of getting an experiment in which they had never been exposed to.
It's true that they some of them had never been exposed, although some of the birds that we caught in Alaska, when we would catch them in the summer, had just been fledged there. So they had only been exposed to the real world for maybe a month or 6 weeks or something. So some of those were brought back. People have studied these in captivity, but it's very hard to breed them because they need a lot of space and they won't breed in the cages very well. We thought about doing that, but setting up a colony is difficult. But we also have put them, and as others have, in constant conditions where they're totally in the same condition for like years without changing the light-dark cycle, and they still will go through these seasonal patterns. But again, a lot of the dramatic changes in the sleep length are due to the exposure. But it's a good question of, do you have to be exposed to changing lighting conditions to develop these intrinsic patterns?
You need to reset the rhythm.
Well, the light-dark cycle does entrain or reset the rhythm, but you will have the rhythm even without being exposed to the conditions. And we've done work on rats where to look at circadian rhythms, for example, and seasonal rhythms and circadian rhythms are probably governed by somewhat similar mechanisms. So we have done experiments where the pregnant mothers and the neonatal rats are exposed to constant conditions or don't get any light-dark cycling, and they still develop their circadian rhythms, but it can influence how they respond to acute changes in lighting. So these are probably genetically determined things that are going to be there whether the birds are born in captivity or out in the wild. But yeah.
Do people who move from northerly climates to southerly climates have better mood?
The question, yeah. So the question is, if you move from a northerly climate to a southerly climate, do you have a better mood? Well, that's also a wonderful question, and there's been a lot of work looking at the role of latitude on mood. And so some studies show that people at more extreme latitudes have more seasonal mood variation and worse mood in the winter than people at more southern latitudes. And some studies have failed to confirm those findings. And one of the theories is that people in general who are very seasonal and have great difficulty in terms of low mood in the winter tend to migrate south, and that the people who remain at these very far north latitudes are a little less susceptible and maybe less seasonal. Certainly if individuals have problems with seasonal variation and they move to more, moderate latitudes, they tend to do better.
Can I follow up on that in that has anybody done studies of people, say, living in Tierra del Fuego or the opposite, where you would expect, if there is really this kind of association, that you would get the same pattern but a reverse time of year?
Yeah, I've looked for studies like that. So the question is, if you're in an extreme southerly latitude, like the tip of South America or the tip of Africa, would you have the same patterns? I suspect you would, but I don't know that there's really a lot of data because the way the Earth is shaped, I don't even think that the most southern latitudes down there are quite as extreme as the most northern latitudes where people live. So humans at extreme latitudes tend to be more in the northern hemisphere.
You have a question.
So a few years ago, I listened to a talk where a gentleman was doing research studying sleep patterns in birds, and birds were actually able to rest one side of their brain, or the other side was awake.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering how that would influence your work here, and if during, say, the migratory period, if they're resting one side of their brain more than the other, and if you've taken that into account or done some imaging studies of your own.
That's an excellent question. So the question is that we know that some birds have the capability of sleeping with half of their brain at a time. Actually, some mammals can do that as well, dolphins and seals, and other sea-dwelling mammals that need to be able to swim and sleep at the same time. And so the question is one of the ways that birds adapt to this by sleeping with one hemisphere unihemispherically. We actually, when we do these studies, we record both hemispheres. So we make sure that when the bird is asleep, both sides of the brain are asleep, and we do it for that very reason. We don't see any evidence of unihemispheric sleep in the birds. That doesn't mean, though, that when they're in the wild and migrating and flying, that they couldn't be sort of napping on one half or the other of the brain. And it's very possible, for example, that when they're in a cage in the laboratory and they can't actually fly, but they can only try to fly, that they're actually sleeping less than they might be in the wild. We don't know that, but that would require doing sort of telemetry studies out.
With the results from your study, what would be some treatment implications for treating bipolar disorder?
Great question. Okay, so what are the treatment implications for treating bipolar disorder? And I think it gets back to some of the data that we actually have from bipolar illness. And I think one of the most important aspects of treating bipolar disorder is to have regular and consistent sleep periods. So we know, for example, that sleep deprivation in bipolar illness can trigger a bipolar episode. And it's thought that the maintenance of an episode of mania is through the sleep deprivation. So that there's lots of data that the quicker you can get a bipolar person sleeping in the middle of a manic episode, the faster that episode will resolve. Conversely, sleep can be depressogenic. So sleeping excessively when you're depressed actually can make you more depressed. Thank you.